Kate Phillip, who is here, who is the program lead of the Presidential Employment Stimulus, and Anda David, who's working in the French Development Agency, have been instrumental in driving and commissioning this piece of research. Unfortunately, the representative of the French Development Agency herself, Anda, cannot be here today. She was called away relatively last minute to join a meeting with the presidency. The research was run here at SALDRU with oversight from Murray Liebrandt. He worked with Ihsaan, Bassier, and Josh, who is here, Budlender, who will be presenting the work. The Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator provided the data and worked with the team to run a survey. And Josh can explain all of this in a lot more detail and much better than me, but the privacy-preserving data collaboration platform, Omniscient, was essential for the data construction and the facilitation of data access. So sincere thank you to these organizations for all the contributions and for collaborating with everyone. Josh will be presenting first on the research, and after his presentation, Professor Kelly Arlington from SALDRU, who is somewhere here, right there, will present on harnessing community resources to enhance learning, examining the direct returns to learners in the classroom that had the PES interns in the schools. Okay, I think I am now supposed to introduce Kate, as I said, who is the program lead on the Presidential Employment Stimulus.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who's here, and will you set me up? And thanks to everybody who collaborated to make this research possible. I certainly believe it's pretty groundbreaking in its technique as much as everything, and so thanks again to Omniscient whose technology made that possible. I'm not actually going to talk to the research, I'm going to talk to the context. And the context is the role of the Presidential Employment Stimulus. So I think where we want to contextualize this work is that, yes, the stimulus effects of these programs are important, and it's one of the elements that is understood intuitively, that if 1 million people more than before earn wage income, it will be good not only for them but for the economy. I mean, intuitively, one would think one can say that. It is also borne out in economic theory, and yet it has been quite hard to make the policy case that these programs are more than just a transfer of income, that they play a whole range of additional roles that matter, not only for participants, but also for the society and for the economy. And so, yes, the stimulus effects are an important part of that picture. But what I want to focus on, because the research will all focus on the stimulus issues, is to step back to why these programs matter. And I think the starting point is that work matters in society. Work matters to people. Is that better? Work matters for all kinds of reasons. Work matters, and it's about more than just the income. I think that participation in work is very fundamental to both social and economic inclusion. Part of the unwritten social contract in all societies in the world is that we need each other, and that those who are able to contribute to the household, to the community, to the society, are expected to do so on the understanding that in every household, community, and society there are people who can't contribute and who need to be supported. That is foundational to social protection, but it's also foundational to the social compact, is this idea that you contribute to the greater good, you contribute to something bigger than just your own self-reproduction. And for that reason, when people are unable to participate in that way or contribute in that way, there is a kind of social opprobrium that is directed towards them. They are not contributing members of the society, and they are not that by choice. In our context of unemployment, people are not in that position by choice. They often quite desperately want to contribute in different ways and to work. Work and employment has become the main mechanism through which people are able to do that, although of course work takes many forms, and sometimes it's unpaid. And sometimes it's volunteer work. But the bottom line is that participation in work matters to people, and for most people in the structure of our economy at present, it is the main means of not only self-reproduction, but contribution to the household and to the community. work also matters in the economy and the society for a range of other reasons. I mean, the fundamental skills transferred through work experience are very foundational for productivity in the economy. So, task management, accountability, time management, teamwork, management skills, organizing skills, these are all foundational for productivity. And that is why we have this problem that when so many people have never worked before, the private sector starts saying, and in fact they say it now very determinedly, they don't want to employ young people who've never worked before because the costs and risks of employing them are too high. These kinds of programs help to break that cycle. Break the cycle in which young people can't get work because they've never had work. And that's partly how we are seeing the programs in the employment stimulus, is as part of breaking us as a circuit breaker in our context where we're trapped in this vicious downward spiral in which people can't get work because they've never worked, productivity has declined. I think at the scale of our unemployment we can say that the impacts on productivity are systemic. So we need programs like this as part of breaking that cycle. The skills that people learn in the workplace and also the marketplace are also foundational to well-functioning societies. So we see participation in work as a critical part of building an inclusive economy and an inclusive society. So unemployment erodes the skills that might have been learned from employment, but people who've never worked before may never gain those skills. I think I just want to briefly talk to, there's this issue of transitions to adulthood, precisely because of what contributing means. When you're a child, you're supported. When you're an adult, you are supporting others. And this truncated transition for young people, this inability to transition from dependence to being self-supporting and supportive adult, has huge psychosocial and other implications that are, I believe, truly toxic for our society and deserve more research themselves. So, breaking the cycle is part of what we're trying to do. So, the presidential employment stimulus was launched in the context of COVID. It was initially conceptualized as an emergency response to an even greater crisis of unemployment that COVID brought on. But we certainly argue that the lessons that have been learned, it was a unique space. An allocation was made outside of the framework of existing programs and policies, and what that allowed was experimentation and innovation and doing things a little differently. And what it allowed was demonstration with a very focused effort to demonstrate how we might reimagine public employment in ways that really emphasize the quality of work experience and the quality of social outcomes. Since October 2020 to now, we have delivered 1.7 million jobs and livelihood opportunities. When I say livelihood opportunities, I mean things like the 180,000 subsistence farmers who have received production input vouchers on their phones to support them back into production and to expand production in the aftermath of COVID, and also the creative sector programs. In the beginning, there was a long list of programs. As you can see, the list has got shorter precisely because we have prioritized programs that were able to deliver quality at scale. And that's not meant to suggest that the smaller programs weren't able to deliver quality, but priority has gone to programs that have been able to scale. So these are all the programs that are currently in play. I won't go through all of them. I'm going to speak to just two of them. The Basic Education Employment Intervention is the program that the research is based on, so I will speak briefly to that. But here is a list of all the programs that are currently in implementation. So the Basic Education Employment Initiative, which is implemented by DBE, and Lala Maja, who is sitting here with us, has been the key driver of implementation from within DBE, and I would like to give her a round of applause because it's a fact. I mean, this program has surpassed expectations. The fact that DBE has been able to roll out over 250,000 placements in 23,000 schools in each year since this program was launched, and with increasing improvements in the quality of outcomes, the quality of training offered, the quality of the experience for young people, has actually been a remarkable story. This program is the biggest youth employment program in South Africa's history. And it has some amazing features. I mean, mentorship is often one-to-one with a teacher in the classroom. That's an amazing ratio for any first work experience. And we have incredible support from within the schools. So if you see this from the school management survey, the study that DBE does, in the poorest schools, we have an over 95% approval rating from principals. I don't think there are many issues on which principals agree that much. Similarly with teachers, over 92% across the board. So people in the schools see the program adding value in the schools, and that's hugely important. To be honest, one of our biggest fears when this program began was that it might actually disrupt schools, and that would really have not been an optimal outcome. But the fact that both principals and teachers assert that they want this program to continue because of the difference it's making is extremely important. And this program is giving 250,000 young people the ability to break that cycle that they cannot get work because they've never had work. It's an 8-month placement, it's a meaningful work experience, it gives them a whole range of tools. What is particularly remarkable about it is its spatial equity. There isn't a community in the country that doesn't have a school at a certain level, but schools are dispersed across the country in a way that nothing else is. And what that means is that because every community has a school, every school has jobs. So on the left, this is Harambee data, on the left is youth employment density without this program, and on the right is youth employment density with this program. It's creating jobs where there just aren't jobs for young people at the moment. The other thing that we're really excited about in this program is that, you know, in the first year, it was just about making it happen. You know, can we just reflect on Lala's behalf? Getting in the first year 300,000 young people paid on time in 23,000 work sites is not an easy task, and it was achieved to a significant extent. So the first year was really just about getting the basics done. But every year since then, DBE has layered the quality of the training offered, and what we're now starting to see is how these teachers' assistants can move the dial on learning outcomes in the schools. Kelly, who you're going to hear from just now, has done some fantastic work on the Fundawande program, which shows that with the right support, teachers' assistants can really move the dial. So the actual statistics are, you have to say this. By term 3, grade 2 learners were 1.25 years ahead of their peers in control groups. This is the difference we can be getting from placing teachers' assistants in schools. We've just had research, hot off the press, also in the room, from a project initiated called Zazi Zandi, which taught teachers' assistants how to optimally teach phonics, which is recognizing and sounding the alphabet. And now the evidence is out that those in those groups are learning the alphabet 4 times faster than learners in the control group. In maths and science, we have the Siyavula app, and the teachers' assistants are assisting learners to use this practice app. They don't have to be maths and science experts themselves. They just have to motivate and mobilize the learners to use the app, and they are quite capable of doing that. So these are all the frontiers in which we're trying to demonstrate that this program matters for youth employment, but it also matters in terms of its potential to move the dial on learning outcomes and to have real social impact. I'm going to speed up. So I won't speak much to social employment, but just to say that one of our programs that is really exciting, actually, is not a classic public employment in the sense that it supports non-state organizations to create work at community level, to enhance the work that they are typically already doing, and to do that at significantly greater scale. I'll give you one example from the 37 implementing partners is Hlanganisa Institute. They have trained 7,400 sisterhood advocates as paralegals. Before this program, they were processing 391 gender-based violence cases a month. They are now processing 6,000 cases a month. And this is just one example from many examples in this program of how this kind of support to what we call work for the common good is amplifying the efforts of all kinds of organizations at grassroots level in communities. We have 37 implementing partners who are working with over 1,000 community-based organizations to get work going at community level to have these kinds of impacts. In conclusion, I think the key message in terms of the presidential employment stimulus is that even where labour has no market value, it has and it can create social value. We have to unlock that value. We need instruments to do so. This is an instrument to do so. That's why we need it to continue. Thank you. Over to the chair.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that really important context. So we'll have Q&A after our two presentations by Josh and Callie, if there are any questions. So for now, I'd like to invite up Josh Budlender, who is co-author on the paper that he'll be presenting about the multiplier mechanism of the presidential employment stimulus. And Josh is a research fellow with us at SALDRU and a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Massachusetts. Thank you.
All right, yeah, hi everybody. Right, so as was just mentioned, this work is co-authored with Ihsaan Bassier, who couldn't be here, but I just wanted to mention that up front. And then we heard from the beginning from Ariane about all the other organizations and partners who've made this research possible. And really, truly, it would not have been possible without those groups, especially the data collaboration component. As you have Julian here from Omniscient, but and Harambe also, they provided data, they ran a survey. So really it's been and of course, the funding side from AFD and the commissioning side from the presidency. So really, we're very appreciative of that, and I think it's just important to just say that up front. Okay, right. So this is, as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at the stimulus effects of the presidential employment stimulus, and specifically the basic education employment initiative, which Kate has been talking about. Before getting into that, I'm going to pick on this because Kate's done it, but I just think it's important to impress upon people the scale of these programs that we're looking at. So the PES is the bigger program, launched at the end of 2020. And just a statistic which is always kind of mind-blowing for me is that up till now, the budget that's been allocated is 42 billion rand, right? So that's a significant budget that's been allocated. And that's created 1.8 million jobs and livelihood opportunities, which Kate has spoken about what those are, like these temporary jobs, like teaching assistants, etc. Then also things like financial support to ECD centers or, small-scale agriculture, etc. And most importantly, what these do is what Kate spoke about. They provide direct employment to people. They help people not live in poverty. They help their families not live in poverty, and people get work experience. They can get skills in terms of the formal sector, and hopefully they can help them transition to other jobs afterwards. And also provide services, right? Like as we're going to hear from Callie, teaching assistants can potentially have a very big impact on student scores. And in general, if we're talking about agriculture or ECD centers or gender-based violence, those are real services which are provided to communities. What we're looking at here is not those two primary kind of benefits, but kind of what maybe is an extra thing, but is, we think, an important thing is this is a very large cash injection, and what it stimulates economic activity in the private sector as well. And the idea here, the logic is that if you give somebody cash, either as a social grant or as an employee or whatever, that money doesn't just get thrown away, right? When somebody goes and buys bread at the shop, for example, at the retailer, that bread gets produced somewhere. And so there's a bakery potentially which produces that bread. That bakery has employees, and if they need to make more bread, they may expand and employ more people. The bread has inputs, right? It has flour that gets produced. So the flour producer may also have to expand and increase employment and wages. And flour comes from wheat. So there's all these linkages basically that are attached to goods which are produced, which are bought. And so what we're looking at is whether spending, an increase in spending on goods, what it might encourage in the rest of the economy and what kind of economic activity it might encourage. Okay. But we are looking specifically at the BEI, which is, as I said, is the biggest part, run by the DBE. These numbers have varied in the different phases, but in general, again, it's really big, right? As Kate said, the biggest youth employment program, public employment program in South Africa's history. Roughly around 250,000 young people are employed in each cohort, roughly a budget of around 70 billion rand for each cohort. And since 2020, over 850,000 young people have been employed, right, in this program. People are paid the national monthly minimum wage for the duration of their employment. So it's not like other public works programs where people are paid below the minimum wage. And they are employed, permanently or full-time, I should say, for those 5 months or 7 months or 10 months or whatever the length of their particular cohort is. So it's a real proper job. What people are doing is they're either helping with learning in classrooms or sometimes helping with maintenance, and the program is focused on no-fee schools and low-fee schools, which is why you see that distribution that Kate showed in terms of the distribution of the program. Our particular evaluation looks at cohort 2, which is hired for 10 months. It's kind of phases 2 and 3, between November 2021 and August 2022. Okay. So kind of what are the 2 key questions we're going to look at to try and get at these stimulus effects? So the first bit is we want to understand how the program affected participants' expenditure. By participants, I mean the teaching assistants, the school assistants, the people who are employed. How did it affect their expenditure? And that is often very difficult to answer because, we have these very wonderful big surveys from Stats SA, but they don't, track who is a participant and who isn't a participant. So we can't see in the existing data how people's spending changes when they enter these programs. But what we're going to use is this retail data from the collaboration I'm going to talk about, which makes it possible for us to compare the spending of participants and non-participants. So that's the first part, characterizing expenditure, because whether people are buying bread or whether they're buying tin fish is going to make a difference as to what kind of multiplier effects we expect in the economy. So we want to understand what people are buying. Then the question is how does that spending recirculate through the economy? We can't calculate a multiplier effect directly. You might have seen, kind of macroeconomists often come up with a number, a multiplier of 0.9 or 1.1 or 1.5, etc. We can't do that, which I'll get to a little bit in detail why we can't do that. But what we can do is we estimate what we call the first round effects. So basically what we're looking at is of this income, of this new spending which happens, how much of it becomes new income to domestic factors of production, i.e. how much of it becomes new income for South African or people employed in South Africa, or becomes kind of capital, returns to capital, whether that's profits or kind of expenditure on capital in South African businesses. And that's the first stage of the stimulus mechanism. If you want to get a real multiplier effect, like the actual number, you then have to ask, of those people who get that income, the person who works in the bakery, what do they spend on? We can't do that level, but we can get the first round, which gives us an idea of the second round and third round, etc. Okay, so just briefly, the data that we use. So the most important data in this project is retailer data from one of South Africa's largest retailers. They have a loyalty program which has many millions of people signed up for it, and when you swipe your card at that retailer, they're going to record what you bought. Okay, many of these programs exist. This is one particular retailer's data. They share that with us kind of on an anonymous basis. We don't see the individuals, etc. But what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to identify who in the data that they share with us is a participant, i.e. is employed in the BEI program, and who isn't, right? And the way that works is Harambee, who holds participant data with explicit permission for it to be used for research, they basically use this algorithm from this privacy-preserving data collaboration platform, Omniscient, Julian's here, which basically means they, on site at Harambee, encrypt the ID numbers, anonymize the ID numbers through a process called hashing, which creates a one-way link. You can't get the ID number back out of that anonymous identifier. And they then upload it to Omniscient's platform. Omniscient then encrypts the retailer data in the same way, right? And that means what you can then get in the retailer data is you can see who in the retailer data is a participant of the program, of the BEI program, and who isn't. You don't see anything else. You don't see their ID number, you don't see any other person identifying information. All the person identifying information has been removed by the hashing and encryption process, but you can see who's a participant and who isn't a participant. We see, what we find is that of the, a significant proportion of people are matched in the retail data. So of the anonymized IDs that Harambee uploads, 62% of those people are found in the retailer data, right? So we find the majority of them, and that's 40% of all participants in the program. So from that, we then create two samples. A treatment sample, which is the participants who are in the retailer data, and a control sample, which is a random 1% sample of people who are not matched, who are in the retailer data, but are not matched into the participant data. Okay, so we have two samples. Very happy to chat more with people about how we did this and the process, and I'm sure Julian is also very happy to chat about it. But I just wanted to show you that this went through a very rigorous legal process, and the people here know how long that took. We've got UCT research ethics approval, and no personally identifiable information is visible to us as the researchers or to omniscience. The retailer can't see the Harambee data. Harambee can't see the retailer's data. So each person only holds their own data that they have access to. Okay, cool. Right, so once we've got that, we've got the sales data for a control group and a treatment group. Another thing that we use, also in partnership with Harambee, is a survey of participants. This, unfortunately there was somewhat low uptake, but the idea is that people don't only spend money at retailers, and we need to see what else people spend money on. They spend stuff at spaza shops, on transport, we'll talk about it just now, people spend money on. So we use a WhatsApp financial diary that was run by Harambee for that. And then we have a couple of other extra data sets, StatsSA's income and expenditure survey, administrative data that SARS holds in Pretoria, and some sort of StatsSA input-output data in the social accounting matrix from Funds FMs et al. Okay. So let's look, this is from the Harambee survey, let's actually dive into it. This shows you, basically, and you should maybe focus more on the kind of the green line, that's the employment stimulus, which is also called the PYEI-BEEI, all these ridiculous names, but that's the program. And what you see is that about 50% of people's expenditure is on groceries, right? Which is a lot, but completely matches what you see in StatsSA's data if you try and select similar people in terms of income or ages, etc. So it kind of matches very well. And what we can then, in the data, it's not on this graph, but we also ask people what kinds of stores they shop at. And of that groceries expenditure, about half of that is at retail stores as opposed to more informal stores, which would be like spaza shops, but maybe even just not big name brand retailers. So what that means is that out of people's spending, about 25% goes to chain retail, and that's what we kind of expect to see in our data, accounting for the fact that we only have one retailer's data. Okay. At the retail firm, what does the data look like? So for our treatment group, what we find is that before the program starts, they're spending around 327 Rand per month. During the program, they're spending around 437 Rand per month. So that's an increase of around 110 Rand, or 33%, which is obviously a very big increase. And we can also see, I haven't shown all of them, there's about 20 of what the retailer calls departments. So you can see spending in a category like groceries or toiletries, or we'll get later to like healthcare and medicine, etc. So we can disaggregate it a little bit at the retailer. So there is this big 33% increase in spending pre-post, but that doesn't really tell us what the effect of the program is, because people's spending tends to increase over time. We have inflation, we have price increase, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare the change in spending for the treated group, the participants, against the change in spending for the control group, which is this random group that we get from the retail data. And this looks complicated, but if you're familiar with what I just spoke about, it's just called a difference in differences estimator. And basically, that's exactly the logic. We're just comparing the change in spending for the treated group versus the change in spending for the control group. The one little nuance to add is that we're restricting the comparisons so that we're only looking at the control group when they shop at the same kind of store and the same location as the treated group. So we're trying to make them have some kind of comparable sample. All right. And what we find is a graph which looks like this, which for us is very encouraging, because what it shows to the left here is before the program starts. And what we see is that to the left, it's kind of flat. The evolution over time of spending for the control group and the treated group is pretty much the same. But as soon as the program starts, spending increases pretty dramatically, right? So that is the treatment effect. That's spending increasing. And if you translate these log points into percentages, what it means is that spending increases more for the treated group by 15.5%. Okay? That's the kind of main headline treatment effect of the program. But what more can we say? What more is interesting? This is what Kate was talking about. This is the same graph, but we've now extended it to go on beyond when the program ends, right? And what you see is that when the program ends, the spending of the treatment group does decrease, sure, but it stays above the baseline level, right? So people are not just immediately, when the program ends, just back to where they started. Whether that's because people are saving, or whether it's because some of the treated group have now been able to find jobs because of their experience, we don't know. But it's encouraging that the program's effects persist beyond just when they're being directly employed. And yeah, it's about a 4% increase above baseline in that post period. Then we can also look at graphs, by department, like I said, and we can see that we, in general, have similarly kind of neat graphs, which have a kind of flat period before, and then when the program comes in, it increases. There are a few cases where that doesn't happen, and those are cases where we can't really conclude either way about what the effect is, and we exclude those from our analysis. Okay. If this pre-period bit is messy, we exclude it from our analysis. Okay. All right, so what are the treatment effects by department? The reason this is important is because the spending effect at the retailer looks nice and big on that graph, but it is probably actually lower than we'd expect. A 15% increase in spending is not nothing, but if people are coming from unemployment to getting this money, why is it only 15%, right? So one reason is that the retailer mainly sells food. Like if you add up this number and this number, about 83% of the retailer's expenditure is on food items, whereas we know from the participant survey that actually people spend around 50% of their income on food items. And food items have what's called a lower income elasticity. They don't respond so much to how much your income changes, because food is a necessity, right? So if your income drops, you still got to eat. Similarly, if your income rises, you will buy more food, but not that much. If we look at items which are non-food items, we see that the responses are generally much larger, which makes sense, right? Those are items that people have some more discretion in terms of what they buy. And we should just bear in mind that that 15% increase, overall increase, is overly weighted compared to what the participants' overall expenditure is. It's overly weighted towards these necessities, which have a lower response rate. So the 15% is certainly an underestimate if you're looking at the program as a whole. The other reason, and this is potentially a very big issue, is that we don't see household spending. We just see spending of individuals, right? Now consider the case that you're unemployed. You've got somebody in your house, maybe your sister works and you do some shopping for her, or your grandmother receives an old age pension, you do some shopping. So you shop. You get the job, right? You're no longer shopping because you're now working during the week. To us, that'll look like a decrease in your expenditure because we can't account for the fact that maybe somebody else in your household is now shopping and using that money. So another important underestimate, we think, in terms of that spending effect is that we are looking at individuals, not households. So that's just important to keep in mind. Okay. So that's the kind of spending side, that's characterizing the spending. But now the real thing that we're interested in, maybe, is the effects on what we call factor incomes, on domestic labor, capital, etc., that first stage of the stimulus effect. Some caveats are in order, okay? Firstly, we do not observe the retail firm's employment response to the spending on the program, right? At some stage it looked like we were going to be able to do that, but it didn't work out in terms of data availability. So we don't see how the firm changes its employment relative to the additional income it gets. We also don't see how the retail firm's suppliers change their employment. We don't see the bakery. We don't see whether the bakery increases its employment, etc., to adjust to increased demand. And we don't even observe all of the BEI spending, right? We see the spending that's at the retailer. So we have to put in some additional data, some additional assumptions, right? Which I'm going to try to be very transparent about. And so you should take this bit as more approximate, right? And there are biases in all different kinds of directions here. This is rough, but it's kind of what we think is our best guess in terms of these effects. And I should also just say at this point, all of our earlier results are public. They're there. If there are other people who want to do different assumptions, maybe macroeconomists, and want to see what comes out, they can, right? This bit that we're about to do now doesn't rely on the proprietary data. So people can take that spending work and then try and extrapolate, do their own extrapolations. Okay. All right, so factor income effects at the firm. Basically, we're trying to say, at the retailer, how much does this extra spending affect how much labor they employ? As we were saying, we don't actually see the firm's employment. So what we have to do is we go to this administrative data that's held at Treasury, and we look at all retailers in South Africa, and we say, what happens at retail firms when they get a sales increase in general, right? How much do they increase their wage bill by, their employment by, etc.? And we're going to use that number to try and say, if our retailer behaves like other retailers, this is roughly what we can expect the response to be. Okay. The kind of, I guess the key number there is 0.72, which means that if sales increase by 100%, we expect that the wage bill, the amount that the firm spends on labor, so that might be due to increased employment or increased wages, is going to go up by 72%. Okay, that's this number there, that elasticity. So we can see that when sales increase in the data, employment or wages, some combination of them also increases. we now do some maths which looks complicated, but is actually like fairly simple to find out firstly that we expect that at the firm there's around 7.5 million rand additional income each month just from the BEI program, right? So the program, as you know, people get this income, and of the people we see, we can say there's around 7.5 million rand increase in sales at the firm. Using this other number, we then say that means that probably, if our firm behaves like other firms, that means the firm increases its wage bill by about 1 million rand a month. Okay, so that's private sector employment of 1 million rand a month from the BEI program, just at our firm. Okay, not even taking into account that they have suppliers, etc. And we can use an analogous elasticity, basically to look at how capital income changes, which could be profits, spending on capital, that kind of stuff. But it's also domestic value added, right? And that would increase by just under 1 million rand. Okay, so we can see that there are these effects. These are what we estimate the effects to be at our particular firm. But that's not really what we're only interested in, right? We want to take into account what happens at the bakery, at the wheat farmer, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and look along the value chain, right? Using what are called input-output tables, which StatsSA produces, which basically say for a firm in industry X, they use inputs from industry XYZ, right? And we're going to include the fact that maybe the bakery gives its staff a lunch, right? So they also consume bread products from the retailer. So there's a kind of backwards and forwards linkages all going on at the same time, which we combine using this input-output analysis methods, which includes a lot of very strong assumptions. Okay, again, for me, very unclear what direction the bias goes. But just to be clear, this is kind of what we're doing. But there are a lot of assumptions in here. And what we find is that apart from what happens at our retailer, right? So out of that roughly 7.5 million that goes to the retailer, we expect around 3.8 million in increased demand from domestic producers of goods, or just via our retailer. And out of that 3.8 million, we would expect that means about 1.7 million increase in wage bill in these downstream industries. So that means incorporating the downstream industries more than doubles the wage bill effect. And it's basically the same for the capital effect. So in total, what that means, just to be a bit clearer, out of the 7.5 million rand of sales at the firm, right? In total, we expect 2.7 million to go to increased wage bill, and about 2.7 million also to go to capital incomes. So out of that number, that increased sales at the retailer, 72% goes to what economists call value added, right? Kind of inputs, the inputs to production. These are the factor incomes in South Africa. Why is it not 100%? Well, because they're imports which go to domestic, which come from other countries, and so those don't contribute to South Africa's production. Also, firms, sometimes don't respond immediately to different kinds of shocks, etc. And we should also note that this capital number here, the capital income split, is probably overestimated because some of the capital income we see in the data is being repatriated to foreign firms. So you might not want to look too much at the capital number, but the number that we think is important is the monthly wage bill number. Okay. So that's looking at the BEI effects at the retailer and at the retailer's value chain. Now we're going to go even further into the assumptions and extrapolations and try say, what can we say about the effect of the BEI program as a whole, accounting for the fact that people don't only spend at our retailer, they spend at other kinds of stores as well, right? So firstly, if you recall, we said that only 25% of spending was at our retailer, right? So now we're going to scale up the spending to account for the fact that there's another 75% of spending which we don't see. This has even more assumptions, and these assumptions are like even more rough. It basically assumes that those retail spending effects we see can just be scaled up linearly, that the shopping at the retailer is broadly representative, that the input-output linkages of the retailer are broadly representative. So this, which is not the case, okay? But I don't know what direction the bias is, but it's kind of our best guess. So you should just take this with a pinch of salt, but it gives us kind of some aggregate effects, our best guess of what the story is. And the idea is that the BEI program increases spending overall by about 53 million rand a month, okay? That is only 5% of that kind of roughly 1 billion rand a month monthly injection of the BEI. Why is it so much less? Because as we spoke about, the retailers spend that 15% of the retailer is low, right, relative to what we actually expect spending to be. So that's an underestimate, that 53 million per month. I'm prepared to stake a lot on the 53 million being an underestimate. The rest of this, I don't know. Okay, it's our best guess, but I'm certain that the 53 is an underestimate. Now, of that 53 million, or however you scale it up, 38 million goes to domestic factor income. That's around 19 million per month to the wage bill, which, depending on if you use average wages, maybe you could say is around 1,800 jobs a month, if those were new jobs. Some of them are not new jobs, right? Some of them are wage increases, etc. So the kind of, I guess the key takeaway for me here is that with all these assumptions, the BEI per month, in addition to the direct effect for people employed at the schools, in addition to the fact that these students are going to get better test scores, in the private sector increases wage payments by around 20 million rand a month. Okay, so that is what I would say is the takeaway, if given all the caveats about the different assumptions. What we also want to do, though, is look at local incomes. People are concerned, Kate showed the distribution of where this program is. Maybe we care more about incomes in local areas, not just nationally. So to get a rough estimate of that, we take out all the value chain effects, because who knows where those value chain things are produced, and we assume otherwise the wage bill is local income. We make a bit of an adjustment for informal spending, which we think has got a higher labor intensity from the Stats survey, and we say that roughly 13.3 million rand per month goes to local incomes, as opposed to just this 19 million rand for incomes at large. Okay. Now let's get even more speculative, but I promise this is the last one. What about social grants, right? Because this is fundamentally the same kind of thing in terms of what we're looking at, just the cash injection component. What if we just scale everything up for the size of social grants, which roughly 250 billion rand a year on the major grants? So if we again use this low underestimate spending effect of 5%, and we then take everything else and we apply it through, and who knows what direction that bias is in, we find that domestic factor incomes increase by around 9 billion rand, and that the wage bill increases by about 4.5 billion rand per year. So again, that's saying social grants are encouraging private sector economic activity to this extent. Okay. Maybe I've overestimated it. There's varying quality of evidence in this presentation, right? We think the spending effects are very rigorously identified, though there is a major issue, which is that they're not representative. So if somebody wants to try and figure out how to make them more representative, that's great. But we think the spending effect is very rigorous. It then becomes increasingly speculative as we move to the factor incomes, as we move to these multiplier effects. Eventually we end up kind of at these factor income effects, and we eventually get to these social grant effects, right? That's increasingly speculative. What are the takeaway messages for us? So the first thing is, one, recall the main value of the program, right? Direct consumption benefits for participants, right? Poverty reduction, right? Two, career experience for the participants. And we've seen some of those persistent effects. We don't know if that's because of people getting jobs or saving or what it is, but there is some persistent effect. But either way, the point is the program will provide career experience for young people who otherwise would be unemployed. And three, as we'll hear from Callie, it provides a service in schools, right? I mean, we can expect this particular program to provide a real service in schools. But the money doesn't get thrown away, right? So people talk about social grant stuff, they often only talk about the cost side in terms of the economic cost, but there is a benefit side as well. And we find from this research that participants do spend on locally produced goods. It's not all just imports. Those goods often do have a high labor content, right? So that's domestic production that's benefiting South African workers. And we also see that firms in general do expand when they get sales increases and hire more labor or pay higher wages. And so when one is evaluating these programs and you're talking about the economic costs, one should also try and think about these kind of economic benefits that it may provide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think it's so important and so interesting, and something that it's raising for me is thinking about NSFAS, which is not actually classified as a social grant in that 250 billion, but thinking about allowances being raised for students and all these sort of multiplier effects. So yeah, thank you so much. Next up we'll have Callie, who is a professor here at SALDRU, and she's going to be chatting to us about harnessing community resources.
Okay, so I'm going to be sharing some results from a project that placed rural youth from the community in schools in a province in South Africa. Interestingly, this project was conceptualized before the BEI, or pre-COVID, pre the BEI, but landed up, it had a sort of pilot year and landed up kind of going to field, going to press at exactly the same time. It was starting in sort of January 2021, and the BEI came into effect October 2022. So I think initially, particularly the intervention partners who were running the program, there was a fair amount of hysteria and panic, but actually it's turned out to be a really good thing, because while it is not an evaluation of the BEI itself, running alongside the BEI, it gives us a model of looking at how community youth can be deployed in schools in a way that actually positively impacts early learning outcomes in terms of foundational literacy and numeracy. And importantly, I mean, you've already seen what Kate showed you. I've got the same pictures. We clearly like those. Like the same pictures. But the key thing here from an education point of view is the spatial footprint is highly equitable. It's really scalable. It gets everywhere because every community has schools. And in the same way, from a youth employment program, it's hard to imagine something else that is so readily scalable and is so easy to get, not easy, nothing's easy, but has such a capacity to expand to disadvantaged communities where there are the least work opportunities for youth and where some of the most disadvantaged underperforming schools are. I normally, my audience is normally on the education side, so I don't normally have any of these slides because everyone's very primed and riled up by the education crisis that we have, the learning crisis. So just very quickly, I mean, this is just one example. This is showing the results from the PEARLS, which is one of these international learning assessments. And what you can see is these numbers are not good, because this means that 87% of our grade 4 learners are not meeting the low international benchmark, which means that they cannot read in a way that they can retrieve meaning from the text, of even sort of literal things from the text. So very, very distressing numbers, but you can see there has been some progress. This number has come down. But come COVID, let me just get rid of this little. Come COVID, you can see a whole decade of progress just wiped out. We also know that these are at grade 4, but the gaps and the problems are starting really early on, right in foundational phase. Another feature of South African classrooms, which is very relevant for this BEI initiative, is that class sizes are high. So if we look, and we're going to be in the Limpopo province, this is saying in 2016, 14% had 46 to 50 learners in a class, 27% had 50 plus, and more recent work on this on the 2019 TIMS, which is another one of these international things that has class size. These class sizes are increasing, so this is not a problem that's getting better. So in other situations where you've had this combination of very poor learning outcomes and an education system that is characterized by very little feedback, formative assessments, because you've got these incredibly large, many reasons, but one is that you have these incredibly large classes. In other settings, like in India, in Ghana, people have effectively used youth to try and improve educational outcomes. And, okay, now this is the bit where, where everyone here knows. South Africa is a particularly promising area in which to try and utilize this unharnessed potential of unemployed youth. So if we think of the NEETs, the not in education, employment and training, we have incredibly high numbers of NEETs, so estimate over a third of 15 to 24-year-olds and over half of 25 to 35-year-olds. And also, we know that most of these are going to be based in disadvantaged areas, including communities where distance is a major barrier to any employment activity. This is the same picture that Kate showed, which is kind of, it's from this Harambee EJ survey, which I honestly don't have a lot of details on, but essentially shouldn't be news to really everyone. These are deserts, job opportunity for youth, deserts all over the country. Okay, so into Fundawanda. So Fundawanda is an NGO that's goals are to have all children reading for meaning and calculating confidence by the end of foundation phase. So that's the end of grade 3, so that's basically when you're 10. And what they do is they've developed in African languages like a core set of learner and teacher support materials, and then they're operating in partnership with 3 different provincial departments of education. And all of them are around this core set of materials, but then there are these different modalities of support. So using coaches in the Eastern Cape, this is running, and it's the evaluation part's smaller, but it's actually a province-wide intervention across all Afrikaans schools. And then where we're going to be is in the Sepedi schools. And here the modality of support is going to be these teacher assistants. So I was tasked to conduct independent evaluations of all of these Fundawanda rolling shifting programs. So in this one, it's 120 schools in the Capricorn North and South districts in Limpopo, which are around Polokwane. So there is some sort of peri-urban, but quite a lot of rural schools too. And the schools were randomized into 3 groups, just business as usual control schools, and then a group that just got the materials, so that means the learner and teacher support materials, which are one-on-one workbooks for kids, and a range of other things, plus some 2 days of termly training for the teachers. And then the final one, every single, well, in the beginning it started in grade 1, but it grew with each grade. So every single teacher gets, for the whole year, their own TA to be in the classroom. So I just briefly want to touch on what Fundawanda identifies as kind of the key pillars of the program, just to give you a little bit more detail about those. So the first is this rigorous recruitment and selection of the youth. So they actually went through a process of a lot of advertising, and particularly in the more rural areas, they went to like a massive effort to enable people to apply and then to conduct these online competency assessments. Together with Harambee and others, and then from the basis of that, they selected, there was a rigorous, they received a lot of applications, then they selected a group who came to a 1-day face-to-face workshop where they worked through various stations, and then finally they selected the final TAs. And this has obviously been done, this program's been running for like 3 years, so it's done each year. The second thing is that, the second pillar is that this program, like a key factor in its success, is that it's run within a structured pedagogy program, which means it's run in a program that is centered around like high quality learner and teaching support materials. So in this instance, every learner gets their own maths workbook and home language workbook, teachers have teacher guides, etc., etc. And that the teachers are trained on these materials, but that, I'll come back to the training, but the youth are oriented to the same materials. So that's another key piece. The next was the mentors, that there was some continuous support. So in ratios of, I think mentors had between 21 and 26 schools that they supported. So they would, beyond the training, there would be school visits and meetings and so on. And then finally, training which was face-to-face, focused on content, focused on practice, etc. So there was an onboarding, and then there's 2 days per term for literacy and 2 days per term for numeracy. So, okay, I think that's a... so what did we find? So what this is showing in, it looks like a bit of a mess, but the LTSM is the materials only arm, and then this is the arm that also got a TA. And what it's showing here is just to make it easy to compare, everything's in standard deviations. But the point here is there is a composite score, like an overall score, which is the main measure. But then there are all these other tasks. So learning to read is, you build foundational skills until you get to higher order skills. And I think the key thing here, so here's the material stuff, which you can see everything's positive. Most are significantly different from 0, where the red line is, but you can see much bigger effects when the TAs are there. And then the important thing, it's kind of all the way through. It's the foundational stuff, but we're also seeing impact on comprehension, which is ultimately the ultimate goal of reading. So what this is showing is taking in each group the control in these two, comparing kids at the 10th percentile in group 1 with the 10th percentile kids in the second group with the 10th percentile kids in the third group, and seeing what the gaps look like. So what we're seeing here, the oranges for the TAs, we're seeing at the very bottom, there doesn't seem to be much of a gap, but it's sort of, just like the 15th percentile that kind of kicks in and grows and then flattens out. So we're not seeing a program that is only working for learners at the top end. It seems to work across quite a wide range of the distribution. This is maths. So very similar things. We find effects for materials, but double the effects for having the TAs. And also, again, from very simple things to working to sort of word sums to these are like number sequences. You've got to put in the missing numbers. So you're seeing gains across that. This is just showing that same gaps, but for the maths. And here you can see with the TAs, even at the very bottom, there's a gap. Kind of a rough idea. Okay, so for the TA, both maths and literacy, they're sort of, for the composite measure that pulls all the skills together, it's about 0.5 standard deviation. So like, what does that mean? So there are lots of methods of doing it, but there's a whole bunch of work by a lot of authors, very eminent, across a lot of across the World Bank and many other organizations, who have tried to standardize learning outcomes across the world. And the idea here, so this is saying that matches to basically about a year of a quarter. Being that far ahead in the South African context means in this domain, maths, in this domain, literacy, these kids are a whole year and a quarter ahead of their peers in the control schools. But when you go to this thing called Learning Adjusted Years of Schooling, which is the paper that I'm talking about, it then says, what does this look like in a high-performing system? So a lay is a learning adjustment. It's kind of like comes from the health disability adjusted years of life kind of thing. So this is almost saying they're learning as much from this program as 65% of an additional year in a highly functional education system. So And the reason to do that is that then this allows you to compare across programs, which is a huge debate about whether and how those things happen. So I mean, those effects are big. They're large. They're not just like the kid could read 2 letters, 2 words, and now the kid can read 4 words. This is also shown if we look comparing the results to benchmarks. So there's been an effort with DBE to create benchmarks for all African languages. And what we're seeing here at the end of grade 2, this is the control group at the top. 18% were reaching the benchmark. And it's 35% for those in the TA and something in the middle. And we've just done another round, and it's reaching the grade 3 benchmark now. It's like 15% in control, but over 30% in the TA arm. So what's happening? What are the TAs? What's the magic? What do they do? They have been some qualitative studies, but the first batch were done during COVID, and in Limpopo the classes are so huge that the kids were coming every 3rd day, so it's just like such a different environment. There's a study that was done at the end of last year, a qualitative observational study, with the results. I haven't seen the results yet. So from my sort of quantitative evaluation, one of the things we did is we took the learner workbooks of like randomly selected learners and counted how many pages had been filled in. So just on one metric, the kids with the TAs are doing, whether it's good work, whether it's correct or whatever, but 159 versus 54. So there's just a lot more evidence of work. I think just to be taken as a proxy. We also asked the teachers unprompted what the TAs do in the classroom. There's a whole lot of things here, but essentially they unprompted, the teachers report they do the things we want them to do. And they say that they don't do the things that they shouldn't do. I know from this qualitative research, this is they do a little bit of teaching, more than they should. And so there are some issues in terms of how that pans out. So it's all well and good, like that we are managing to like shift the needle. And when you compare these to other education studies, these effects are, they're big and they're making a difference. Like the benchmarks say, is the percentage of kids on track, and those things are doubling and whatever. But is it affordable? So this is just showing, so the size of the boxes matter. I've done this for the literacy component because we needed this for something. But so all I've done is just the training and the materials only include literacy, but otherwise it's actually it's the whole program cost. But half is the TA stipend, associated to minimum wage. And then the next biggest thing is the mentoring. So you can kind of see roughly how the spending splits. So the total cost per learner is a whopping 2,571 Rand, which as a standalone education intervention is like way too expensive to even consider scaling. And remember, this is the cost of running it like that. So there are certain things when you scale that would reduce or whatever. But anyway, we're not even in the ballpark. But the point is, how did Fundawanda finance this? So it was financed through leveraging funds from the youth employment programs. So it didn't actually use PYEI, but it's very similar. Yes, pays a stipend, minimum wage, plus it works out about an average of 8.3% additional that you get depending on how long they stay, which is similar to what the BEI, or certainly in the phase 2-3, had like the allocated expenditure was also like 92% stipend kind of thing. And then they benefited from another thing, the employee tax incentive too. So if you're employing new jobs for young people, you can get a rebate for that. Okay? So these are also things to continue at scale, because if things were run through DBE, I mean, this is the source of income, but government's not going to be able to claim this, but then obviously other costs would be dramatically reduced in terms of like organization, etc. Anyway, so what does this mean? This money covers 81% of the costs of running the program. So if you think about it, we want to do this, we're going to leverage these funds of this youth employment program. If we spend this much, we can get these educational outcomes. How does that compare, like internationally? So that gives us 2.44 lays, learning adjusted years of schooling, which is a years of high quality education. And so that puts us about kind of here. And if you look at things like, where is it? Like the second one, structured pedagogy, you can see it compares like fairly favorably. I mean, this is the problem with all of these returns things. So these ridiculously high returns are for an information campaign. But this idea that, yes, it has a little effect, but that you can then multiply it by $100 and get like, then we'd have everything solved in seconds. So all of this pinch of salt, whatever, but it's just trying to locate, are we in the space where this is a plausible kind of thing to do? Okay, we all know about the basic education employment intervention, but the main thing, and as I said, Kate and I like the same maps because they're cool. So this is just showing, this is the 2023 schools placement. So these are all local municipalities, and the colors, the darker blues just mean more. Knowing what you all know of South Africa, that's Gauteng, there are many more people, there are many more schools there. But the key point to make here is it gets everywhere. And I mean, that's quite remarkable if you think of trying to do a youth employment program at scale, that you can just do 250, like $250,000 and get them everywhere. And then, like, as an education intervention as well. There are not many education interventions that lend themselves so readily to scale and in such a geographically equitable, managing to reach some of the most disadvantaged and remote communities. So, kind of, where does that leave us if we think we've got this very small study? It was in 40 schools. Yes, they were typical no-fee schools in South Africa. I think, generalizability is always a problem, but they're a typical setting. So they certainly, maybe they don't generalize across the country, but they are certainly the majority of South African schools. Findings from there would be at least relevant, if not representative. So you've got this PEI that has shown, as Kate was also showing, it's politically feasible. The unions did not have a problem with it. The principals and the teachers wanted to carry on. And it operated at scale. So you've kind of got you've ticked that box, which actually is not trivial when we think about scale. And Funda Wanda is showing at least that it is feasible to meaningfully impact learning outcomes, and to do that in a way that is reasonably cost effective, but provided certain things are in place. So I just want to take us back to the pillars. So obviously with any randomized control trial intervention, there's a package. You evaluate the package. It's impossible to say this piece mattered the most, this piece mattered the least. If I got rid of this piece, it wouldn't make a difference. Nevertheless, both the program itself has gained a huge amount of insights over time, and there have been qualitative pieces of work, and these really are the pillars that have been identified as absolutely crucial. So it's obviously never, even though the BEE has kind of shown proof of concept in terms of being able to do this at scale, taking each of these pillars, it's not trivial about how scalable they are. And obviously there's a cost dimension, but there's also like a logistics and can you maintain quality at scale and so on. So just to think through each of them. So the first is the rigorous recruitment and selection. So the idea here is that there has to be selection. You can't just have like any youth pairing. This is probably not an issue for scale. If you look at the numbers who applied both for Budlender but for like the 2023 round of the BEI, there's a huge number of applications. So the ability to do some kind of screening is easy. Yes, maybe in some of the rural areas not so much, but by and large. Secondly, the whole sort of competency assessment, that was done online. So that is scalable, both in terms of cost and logistics. So I think, given our high youth unemployment, given how many people apply for these opportunities when they come up, that's an easy one. The second is, if the TAs are going to have an impact in the classroom, it matters what happens in the classroom, what they do. And so Budlender is firmly of the opinion that it needs to be in the context of some sort of structured pedagogy program that is around a core set of materials. Those don't have to be Budlender materials. There are lots of open source materials that can be used. But the idea is that both the teacher and the TA need to be orientated to the material. So just as an example, the teacher wants to take a group of kids to go do small group guided reading. The TA knows the workbook and they've both been taught on the workbook, so can actually take the other group and say, let's work through this thing together. And that is sort of the key of making sure that the activity is actually educationally meaningful. Of that 484 that was left, about 40% of it's from this, because this also includes teacher training. They know from the Western Cape that the materials go down by 40% if you do it like at provincial scale. So there is room. So I think this is kind of doable as well. The next was the mentors, the continuous support. So that's quite inexpensive. It's 13% of the whole cost. Budlender employed very high-skilled mentors. It was the very first time doing this. Wasn't not clear how much support the TAs had needed. It was the TAs performed better than beyond expectations. So in future iterations, this would definitely be exploring a model where previous TAs then become mentors to TAs at like 125% of the rate, that kind of thing. So this is definitely an area to be looked at. And then probably the hardest part is this training. If you want to have face-to-face training that is focused on content, includes practice, is run by highly skilled people, this is now then like a real challenge to be producing at scale. But and when we say scale, we don't have to go. Where's that picture? You know, scale can be a district. Scale can be a province. You know, yeah, the models and partnerships for those models would need to be explored. So I just and so I think what this is showing is it's such an opportunity. It's under threat. It's not necessarily going to get the financial support it got, but certainly even if the PYEE is a PYEI, and then the BEI is like a reduced form. I think there's real potential here for an education program to leverage funds from youth unemployment and flipping it the other way for youth unemployment to leverage into an education intervention that is cost effective from an education point of view, to ensure that there are these outcomes beyond the meaningful employment opportunity for the youth and the multiplier effects, etc., and that we can actually improve learning outcomes. And I think there are binding constraints lab people here who've taken one portion of this in the Ihsaan to try and focus in on even a sort of narrower thing. Can you push? And so hopefully in the questions they get a chance to share some of the stuff that they've been doing. Thank you, Callie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Now, I've been getting hospital passes since yesterday, having to deliver remarks when other people don't show up here. So I'm certainly not an academic, and many of the things that I hear, I would not know the technical aspects of it. But I think as a kind of a broad response, we know that South Africa has battled unemployment and by extension the triple challenges of poverty and inequality since the advent of democracy. But many of those challenges have been exacerbated over the last decade, and even more exacerbated by the pandemic as well. As somebody who's worked in the youth development sector for almost a decade now, I must say that, and of course I'm biased here, but I must say that the sixth administration has had a very technical response and a very cohesive response to the challenge that we face, particularly of youth unemployment. Yeah. I think the president himself is really concerned about young people, and their hopelessness, their despondency, the corrosive effects of unemployment. And I think it's always been a case that South Africa needs structural reforms. We need changes in the macroeconomic, energy and logistics and connectivity. And there are plans. Operation Budlender is driving that major economic response of structural reform. But there's also a view that young people can't be expected to wait for long-term changes in the economy. Many of them need support now in the immediate to be able to sustain themselves, to be able to see hope for the future. Yeah. And I think the combination of these two programs working together, the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention and the Presidential Employment Stimulus, are having some degree of impact. Right? So while unemployment remains high in South Africa, we have seen positive aspects. So for example, for the last 8 consecutive quarters, we've seen marginal decreases in youth unemployment quarter on quarter. For the first time in a long time that I can remember, the 25 to 34 age group is under 40% of unemployment. Right? So the figures are high, but we feel that they're moving in a positive direction. And I think the presentations highlighted the reasons why they're moving. I think it's also important that there seems to be some degree of a false dichotomy being created between work and grants. The social relief of distress grant was a very specific response to the pandemic. It continues to play an important role, and I think its future remains to be determined. There are many conversations about comprehensive social protection. But it's important to say that from a policy perspective, we see these programs working complementarily to each other and not necessarily as a binary of grants of work. Yeah? But I do want to make one point, is to say, I do think we need to think about the generation of young people that we want to cultivate. Yeah? Do we want to cultivate a generation of young people who have to suffer the indignity of standing in a queue at the post office every month? Or do we want a generation of young people who feel like they are active citizens in this democracy, feel like they have a role to play, feel like they have a place to go when they wake up in the morning? Yeah? And I think it touches back to Kate's point that she started with. Work matters in society. Work has a much more important distribution than just economic value. And that I think is particularly important for young people. So thanks very much. I'm very interested to hear the questions and answers on the presentation. I have a couple of my own. But yeah, thank you very much to the three presenters. I think all three presentations were quite intriguing. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that. Presenters, are you happy to stay seated? Do you want to come up? Okay, let's see how it goes. Maybe you can direct your question to a presenter if it is specific. And I think, Tanya, you'll monitor online. Okay, great.
Thank you very much. I think the presentations they're encouraging. I am coming with my colleague from National and from Limpopo. My name is Ihsaan. I just want to check that my question is not directed to one specific presenter, but I'd like to take it from the closing remarks. When you say if this funding can be flipped, it goes into the education system, what would be the impact? But I want us to look at it and look at what would be the role of institutions of higher learning, universities in particular, TVET colleges. If we look at what all of you were saying, it tells us that as a country we have the capacity and potential to come up with a very brilliant program which we can tailor-make and maybe a 1 year or 6 months program for teacher assistants in the country for our system, which can be responsive to all the areas, whether a teacher assistant finds himself or herself in a rural school or in an urban school or peri-urban or whatever the kind of farm school. If we can come up at university level with such a program, then when we have something like this, we know that when we bring these people as teacher assistants, not for a temporary period, 5 months, 6 months, but as a permanent future in the schooling system, we can first train them for a year like they do in the UK. We train them for a year, they get a qualification, which can even stimulate them to think of becoming teachers later in the years. And we know the issues that the general assistants were handling in our schools. We get TVET colleges to come up with a program that will be more practical for general assistants, and it becomes a permanent future, because in the past, in the olden days, we used to have, whether they called them, but they were not called handymen, but these people were there. When we have desks having issues, they'll fix them. Now, if you go to most of our schools, for those who went to Limpopo, you'd have seen a pile of steel and wood that came out of desks that were not necessarily quality desks, and they are not fixed. So we end up not having desks for all the learners in the classroom. But if we have a person who is designated for each school, even if it's one person, they will handle all this handyman work required, that is supposed to be done by this general assistants. Because remember, in our case, we had 2 teacher assistants and general assistants. So is there something that we're thinking? Because we have implemented the program successfully for 3 years, or maybe let me say 4 years technically. What I'm going to leave it like that and leave it at the research level with so much beautiful outputs coming out of the research. Food for thought.
Thank you. I think I'm going to take a couple at once. So I did see Andrew's hand. Are you fine? Okay. Let's go here, and then I'll go to that side. So.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. I'm Lala Maja from Basic Education, and I was just saying to Kate, firstly, Harambee is holding the data for DBE and provinces, so acknowledge DBE more than Harambee. They are a partner in in terms of the MOU we signed. And I also thought that maybe just to acknowledge that Fundawande was a partner that we signed an MOU with. Remember, we started with this program in 2020. That was the first implementation. And if you check, you'll find that the features of BEI are the same from 2020 to 2023. The main difference is that in 2020, we were addressing the fact that people have just lost employment, and we were not that strict. And that is why we took them in December. We started in December when schools are closing in 10 days' time. So we didn't even care that schools are closing. We said there's no bread in that house of that young boy and girl. They need to find something to place on their tables, because we know that most of young people are the ones who are working in restaurants, and those restaurants were closed, hotels were closed. So they didn't have work, and therefore this was really to address them. But when you go to the other outer years, you find that we were a little bit more strict in terms of how we are selecting even the young people. But from the onset, Minister Motshekga has said, we are education, we can't take people into our schools and we take them just to go and sit and bask in the sun. They must come as capacity to support teaching and learning. They must come to support and protect teaching time. So those schools who listened from 2020, yes, will reap the benefits quicker than those who listened a bit later. Because some might have thought, this is a relief for my own children. But later, as we were busy advocating and so forth, protection came even from SGBs, from teacher unions, that we have to stick by the rules. So Fundawande was our partner. I signed an MOU with Fundawande. They were also helping us to train as part of the civil society that were training young people, especially in the reading. Those were doing literacy, reading. So we took civil society to support the reading champions. So they were training them and providing mentorship. I know that they are funded through their own means, but they were supporting the department in that regard. From 2020, they started doing that. And it got even better as we continue to implement. So we know that our reading champions, I can give you examples of what they did in the sector. It's amazing. The innovation and creativity that they brought in terms of making learners to love reading. They will take learners outside and act the whole play and so forth. So really civil society's role is quite important. We can't leave it out even when we go forward. Because they are able to galvanize those funds to support in terms of mentorship and to support in terms of training, which we are not able to do as a department. We allocate the teacher as a mentor, but we know that teachers will give these young people time, but specific training that is offered by NGOs is still required. We do want to appoint mentors. We have seen that it is something that is needed. That we have young people that are placed maybe at the circuit to look after a number of schools, looking at these young people, so that when they have challenges, they know where they go. Because currently when they have challenges, where do they go? Social media. So I pick it up in social media and it's not good. I also wanted to make the fact that this changes lives of young people. In the Eastern Cape, for training of handymen, those who are maintaining schools, because we have different categories. But the young people that were servicing schools in terms of maintenance. They took them for accredited training. I've seen pictures of some on Facebook. I'm building my own house from the training that I got from the accredited training, because now I'm a plumber. I did plastering, I did bricklaying, I did this, I have my certificate. And they also did help them with courses that are not necessarily for school, like pigeon farming, which was done in Eastern Cape. Now this boy has her own, she managed to start his own business. So there's quite a lot of interesting things that came out where we see communities, we live communities that work. So it's not only about the school or the young person, we live the community that works, that love their school, that can protect the school. Because imagine during COVID, how many schools were vandalized? So when these young people came into our schools, vandalism go down. There's someone, even if I'm outside, they will still continue to protect their schools. Even if they're outside, they know the value, because they have tasted the value of being an employee in that school, not just being a learner. The last one, learners who couldn't attend school, because remember during COVID, young people were abused in their own homes. So these same young people were able to take out learners from home that don't want to come back and bring them back to school. And they see that the school is where they are protected. So there's really major benefits, and we highly appreciate the reports that we have seen. I just want us to also acknowledge, I have a colleague from Western Cape, Ihsaan, a project manager in Western Cape, work with her. Really a lot of good work happening here because of her from Limpopo as well. So we came just to come and support this report, but we really appreciate the work that is done. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you had a question.
I don't think I can introduce myself now. My question is around the Fundawande. We trained all our years on this program last year. And we started a pilot in District North with certain schools, very volatile schools. So, but now we hopefully on the brink of starting a new phase, we're going to hear soon. But it will help me for my planning, for even for long term. The question is, during the pilot phase, has there been research done, and where is it located? Is it located at your side or within Fundawande itself? Because I mean, those findings will be valuable for us in our planning stage now. Because if it can work at those volatile schools, I mean, in order for me to have my superior size admission, I must speak about facts, you know. So it will be great for us to have those figures and those findings in order to put those steps in place to have this program in other schools also. I have no doubt that it's working. But Limpopo had it, and I was to speak about Western Cape because we're running a pilot now. So where can I obtain those findings, Lala? Will it be within the wonders?
I think I'll ask Kelly to respond to
Yeah, I mean, they're all on the Wonder website.
Okay. On the pilot that's been running in North?
Sorry?
The pilot of the PYEI that's been running in North?
Yeah.
Are we talking about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the pilot of the PYEI, no. So the Fundawande teacher assistants, which is run along the same lines, they're not actually PYEI.
Okay.
So, and then there is Fundawande is across, has been rolled out across all Afrikaans schools in the province. So in terms of like what we're saying, those pillars, that's sort of already in place.
I'm specifically looking at that because I had to write a submission last year in order for that pilot or those schools to take on the assistants and to train them, you know, for the project. Bearing in mind that we're going to use those findings to put things in place for schools for 2024 onward. So I was just thinking of where I can get those findings.
responses, Kelly, to the first two? Oh, sorry.
Can I just add one thing? The other thing that I think is quite critical, which my colleague touched on, the TAs. We are supposed to, remember, teachers in schools have teaching standards that tells them what to do and what not to do. So, and the code of ethics for teachers. So I know we are in conversation with SAIS, which is the Council for Teachers, to say that anybody else who has to enter the school must also have standards that tells them what to do and what not to do, because we saw some of our TAs getting in trouble. And of course, courses that can help us to have this as a permanent, we have to think about it, because SAIS is thinking along those lines, that we have to have paraprofessionals in our schools. So yes, universities, that's a plus point.
Any responses before we move on?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, those are like obviously reflections rather than like specific questions, but I think that they do speak a lot. I mean, I go specifically from Lala about DVE, I think it is just worth emphasizing how important it was that DVE was so quick to get these things and so flexible about getting the programs rolled out. Like you're saying about December, I mean, just in terms of my narrow thing of the stimulus effects, it's not something we could look at here, but there is a lot of research from around the world that shows that these kinds of stimulus programs are much more effective in moments of crisis when there is like slack in the labor market. And so making sure, you know, when it was December, like you said, being like, we know that we've got to give people this kind of employment now, even though there isn't, you know, the schools are out or whatever, that's crucial not just for those individuals, but I think one would expect whatever the multiplier effects are to be larger in those periods when there is a lot of slack in the labor market. So it's important for a variety of reasons, but that is one other thing as well.
Kate, any other questions? Online question, Tanya?
So this is from Sean Miller. That's some comments, I think. So I'll read it. It says, thanks for the presentations. Unfortunately, I missed the first. This is worthwhile work and good to see it being done so thoroughly. Leaving other quibbles aside, what concerns me is the advocacy component that overlaps with the research component. Two specific points. One, the very strong assumptions behind the estimation of the indirect effects from the PYEI means that it would not be justified to take the back of the envelope conclusions about job creation and use those for policy decisions. Yet one gets a sense that they may well be used for that purpose. And then number two, the suggestion linked to Fundawanda that selection and screening is scalable is almost certainly wrong. The processes can be scaled, but that is not the same as scaling the outcomes of the processes. There are international examples showing that this is not the case, but it also follows logically as a larger proportion of the applicant pool is actually selected. Quality must go down unless the selection process is completely
Thank you. I'll take another two questions before responses, if there are any. Andrew?
Well, I just want to make two macroeconomic points. So the first is that Kelly's research shows that there are quite dramatic improvements in productivity that can be achieved by moving in a more labor-intensive direction in this sector. I think that's probably a result that applies to much of the services sector, and the services sector is 67% of the economy. So I think you're talking about something here, although you're focusing narrowly on what happens in schools that this is being piloted. I think you're saying things that are relevant to far the most important macroeconomic question that we face in this economy, which is the link between productivity and employment. It's not just a link between productivity and employment, it's also employment in a particular, with a particular technological structure to it, and wage education and some other is important as well. But I really think this is a hugely important finding in, and it emerges from a sector that's managing things is labor intensive. But that doesn't mean that there are not parallel implications for health, protection services, retail activities, home building, maintenance, And then the second point is to link to Josh's work, which is that if it is the case that the productivity can be improved across the economy by moving in a more employment-intensive direction, that also will consequently increase the multiplier. So I think macroeconomically about multipliers. So it's about the labour content and wage content of spending in the economy and the linkages associated with tax systems and imports. All of those are quite low in the context of the kinds of employment decentralised across the economy. And if I can just respond quickly to Sean, I think his scepticism about scalability seems quite misplaced to me. These are not programs. One is not a program that's trying to recruit teacher assistants from the economy as a whole for the pilot sites in which it's being implemented. There are limits to scalability. You have to expect some reductions in the quality management programs as you scale up, but I think he's underskilled.
Thank you. I respond to that as well, because just on the recruitment piece, I think that is the most scalable piece. Just anecdotally, Budlender has, my understanding, is a very intensive recruitment process, but I don't actually think that's necessary. The rest of the programs the government has had has been very much, there's a matric, you have to have a matric, so that's the selection criteria, and the schools have selected. There were a lot of comments about who are the schools selecting, etc. But on a few different programs I've worked on, it's actually come up that there's pretty high quality people. So we worked with the Western Cape government when I was at JCAL on a program where we selected our own recruits in this kind of market, and a lot changed because it was a part-time thing. And we ended up taking old TAs from the schools, and they were much higher quality. And those were who the schools had selected. And then in Zambia, we've had the same. So we wanted to select our own people to try, and the Department of Education in Eastern Cape asked us to continue with the TAs. We were worried about that because they'd been a year over the schools. And generally, the people we found, they were fantastic. And the NGOs we were working with commented on how fantastic they were. So I think there will be problems. Everything's not going to be perfect. But I think that the scalability of the recruitment piece is far easier than the scalability of the, actually I would say the mentoring piece, even more than the training. I think there's such an expanse of amazing partners that could support a good training, quality training model, but this continually supporting people and being able to fund a model with some continuous support, I would say, is the biggest scale question or sustainability question in our view. And we've been thinking about how this goes.
Thank you. So I want to see if there are any hands this side, because I thought I missed some earlier.
Can I also just add that the young people that are recruited from 5 kilometers around the school are young people that were in that school. So principals are choosing people that they know. They were their students. And therefore, yes, they're choosing the best that can come and work inside their school. So I really want to agree with you that it is scalable. And again, we are choosing people that are around the location of the school. Generally, it's people that are going to protect that school, that are going to also go in with the values that they were taught in the same school.
Kelly, did you?
And it starts with recruitment as well, because it's clear on the specification when they apply that the distances should be like this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the point of the extreme is obviously true. The larger the scale, I mean, there is definitely going to be in terms of quality of recruits and what good match of recruits to the tasks required. But I think the nature of our unemployment problem is such that you've got to go a long way on scale before that's an issue. So. And I think what's the online, I think what Budlender is saying is that the online assessments that they did, which are cheap and easy to do, were a good screening tool to So in the same way, like you use matric, but it's pretty blunt. And they were saying this very scalable, cost-effective, you know, making everyone go through that, you know, those online things was doable and worthwhile.
In the midst of online challenges that most of our beneficiaries are experiencing, especially when you look at Eastern Cape, parts of KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, where, I mean, just to get access, even when you have data, getting access and network connectivity is a struggle.
So, I mean, as an example, on a very small scale, what Budlender did is they, in the more remote areas, they had days at schools where there was tablets and, you know, they had a whole thing where people could come. So they're all, yeah, they're potential.
Yeah, I think like people like you, Ihsaan, have come up with some very like simple indicators that you could check on, which are much less expensive and will also help with some of that indicator stuff.
So we have Kate and Josh or chance to respond, and then Kelly, I'm going to ask you to come up to close for us. Good.
So I think I mainly need to respond to Sean, so can online hear me if I talk? So yeah, so the question of, you know, I hope that we were quite clear about the level of rigor attached to each part of the analysis. And, you know, some parts, those conclusions are more rigorous than other parts. But it is, you know, there's a trade-off. There's a question where if you look at narrower questions, you can get more rigorous answers, but then you are restricted to narrower questions. And there is a question about, you know, how broad do you go before what you're saying is just nonsense? Like, there is a line where you don't just want to say nonsense. And it is something that Ihsaan and I grappled with for sure on this project, partly because the original proposal and research design used data from the retailer, which they subsequently weren't able to make available, which would have meant a clearer look at the employment effects. And then we kind of said, okay, well, how do we adjust even though we don't get that data? And so, yeah, I think there is a question about what the correct level is. I think that given that we were quite clear about what is more credible and less credible, I hope that people take that seriously. And you know, in terms of the feedback into policy, I think it depends which specific back of the envelope calculations you take issue with. So, for example, what I would call genuinely back of the envelope in this analysis are the things about scaling it up. And the ones that are scaling it up, in my view, certainly underestimate the effect of the program. You know, the one which is complicated for me, and I really don't know how to think about it, and maybe there is an overestimate there, is the input-output analysis and this kind of structural accounting matrix and how this stuff goes to the rest of the economy. But you know, that's not our own stuff, and that's not back of the envelope. There we use the established methods in that literature. Now I am not always so comfortable with the methods in that literature, so that's why we said this. But that was not back of the envelope stuff. That is what people do in that literature. And so yeah, you know, we put caveats there because even though it's the standard practice, we're not so sure about it. We think it's not as transparent as the rest of the stuff. So that's what we did. And then the other back of the envelope stuff about scaling up, again, I really, if the question is about, you know, undue advocacy, I think that, you know, if we're scaling up and we're saying that out of an additional $1 billion of income per month, only 50 million increase in spending, that is surely an underestimate if you're just talking about the spending increase. So, and I think there are very good reasons, as we spoke about, why the spending increase is probably underestimated. Yes, well, how that translates into a wage bill effect, etc., that's up for debate. But that's not the back of the envelope stuff. That's the input-output stuff. And then, yeah, and then, you know, the question about advocacy is, you know, we're not saying you must do this policy. The last point was about costs and benefits, and saying there are obviously costs and benefits to this thing. We're just saying this is part of the benefit probably that needs to be considered, that there will be, you know, the spending doesn't just disappear. It's not saying it's going to create X amount of jobs or whatever. I hope nobody thinks that that's going to make some kind of prediction. But we're just saying there are these benefits which if you don't talk about seem to disappear from the conversation. So we're saying we do need to consider them even if they're not very narrowly parameterized.
Thanks, Josh. Kelly?
Okay, so I would just on behalf of all the people from Ihsaan and SALDRU who are not here, because they're all in Joburg, just to say thank you to everyone who's here in this room and to all the presenters, and then also to all the participants online for I think what was a very interesting an informative and inspiring couple of, how long have we been here for? A couple of hours. Yeah, and we look forward to finding that the confirmation of the next round of the BEI, which we hope to hear about soon, happens, and if not, if it doesn't happen quite in that guise, that this work is taken forward, even if it's in smaller sort of provincial or district pockets. Thank you.